I guess it's important to mention, since it is a very big topic, gluten-free and glutinous grains. So the glutinous grains are any wheat species. So it could be, there's a number of different wheat species. We would say whole wheat, but there's also cracked wheat, bulgur. And then actually the very oldest form of wheat, what they say is the most ancient species, is called einkorn. And some people claim that that type of wheat is not as allergenic as what we would call the modern type of wheat, the wheat that has been changed over the years in agriculture. And then some of these other varieties of wheat, emmer, fricka, spelt, kamut. Some people just, refer to whole wheat as wheat berries. And then there's barley and rye also that are glutinous. And then all of these others do not contain the same type of protein, which is gluten, that these others do. So all of these tend to be considered gluten-free grains, including popcorn, by the way. And here's something, a lot of people don't realize that corn is a grain. They always think it's a vegetable, but it's not. It's actually a grain. It's in the grain family. It has the same kind of anatomy as other grains have. It has a bran and it has a germ. And by the way, a popcorn is a separate species. It's different from like field corn. How do you know whether you're getting whole grain foods when you're shopping? Some of them may carry this label. It's called the whole grain label. It's from an organization called the Whole Grain Council. And it depending on how much fiber or how much whole grain is in the product, you can see one of these labels on it. It's like you can go up to 47 grams or more per serving of whole grain, or as low as 8 grams per serving. But this is just one thing, you could look for that on some of your products if you're not sure how much whole grain there might be in there. You would typically see these on breads or crackers or pastas, cereal products, those types of, any type of grain product. So here's something interesting. I always like to compare ingredient lists on breads, especially for, looking at what is the difference between this 100% whole wheat bread and maybe another 100% whole wheat bread. They're both 100, I have another one. This one is 100% whole wheat. So what that means is all of the grain is wheat and is whole. So, and we see the very first ingredient says whole wheat flour. So check one off good for that one. It's a whole wheat. But then you got the second ingredient is water, and then the third ingredient is high fructose corn syrup. So that kind of puts a damper on this one because it has that sugar in it, which, if it were a really like a higher quality type of bread, it would probably not have high fructose corn syrup in it. It would use some other, something else. Breads typically, in order to start the yeast and the rising, they do have to have some type of a sugar. So most of the time it's honey if it's a good quality bread, but when it's I guess what we would call a more mainstream type of bread, it's unfortunately using something like high fructose corn syrup in there. And then you're starting to see a lot of other things too, which makes it a little questionable. So if it's 100% whole, then why do we have all these additives in it? Why do we have to add calcium in and add vitamin E and vitamin A and vitamin D? So it's a fortified food, meaning they added in synthetic vitamins to it. And then they have all of these other things in there. A lot of the, for example, this DATEM, it's an acronym for a very long molecular name that I can't remember right now, but I think it's diacetyl triethyl something. But it's like a preservative, or like a dough conditioner of some kind. And so there's all these different things. And you know that if you were making bread at home, you wouldn't have all of these things in there. You would have your flour and your water and your honey and your yeast, and that would pretty well be it. That's why I always tell people, read the ingredients, and if there's more than a handful of ingredients in there, you have to start to question whether or not it's really a high quality product. So compare this 100% whole wheat grain bread to this one. And this is actually a sprouted grain bread. It does have a handful of ingredients in it, but they're all whole grains or all whole foods for the most part. It's sprouted wheat, sprouted barley, millet, malted barley, lentils, soybeans, spelt, water yeast. There is a little bit of added wheat gluten in there and sea salt. So obviously there's no chemicals added into this. There's no synthetic vitamins added in. It's just a higher quality type of bread. And it also says it's 100% whole grain. So just because it's 100% whole grain doesn't necessarily mean, as in the previous example, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good one. So what are these sprouted grains? You know, that's another thing. Oftentimes people want to know what is the benefit of that, you know, and what is it? Why are we doing that? So here's a really good image of this. So on the left side here, this is my left. This is the unsprouted grain. This would be like if we had, let's say we had some wheat that we harvested in the field and we let it dry. And then ultimately it may get ground into like a whole wheat flour to use to make for bread. Or we could let it get, you know, put it in an environment where there's a little bit of moisture and there's also a little bit of the right amount of light. And then it is almost as if it's going to start growing a new plant. And so the little grains start to sprout, and that's from the germ portion of the grain. So they start to sprout. And what this actually does is you have to remember I said that grains are like a seed. They're the seed of a plant. So that the seeds are designed to be able to last for a very long time. They're kind of like dormant until they get planted. And then they can like come alive again. They sprout. So what is happening when the sprouting process is going on? Well, what's happening is that there's like an enzyme process that's happening, and it starts to almost like pre-digest starches, and sort of breaks them down a little bit. There's also some minerals and things that have been in the outer part of the grain that are kind of like locked up and bound in there and not easy for our bodies to absorb. But once they get sprouted, it breaks down compounds that lock in those minerals. So now the minerals are much more freed up for our bodies to be able to absorb them better. And so the sprouting of a grain it's a very old traditional food preparation technique that people used to do it in the old days, and then when we had modern farming, it just kind of went by the wayside. But there are some companies that are doing it now. It's like making a comeback, basically, that you can sprout the grain. And like if you do this at home, this is something you could actually do at home. You could just buy some dry grain and then do your own sprouting. And then once the sprouts form, there's one of two things you can do with it at that point. You can decide to make it into bread at that point. You could literally just put the moist sprouted grain in a food processor with some yeast and honey and water and blend it all up. And then it kind of does form like a dough. And then you'd shape it into your bread and you can bake it. And that's a sprouted grain bread. They call that flourless bread because you never really ground the grain into flour. You just let it sprout and then blended it up. The other way would be to let them sprout and just to the point where they start to make a little sprout, and then you dry them. You're going to put them in like a dehydrator at a very low temperature, enough to evaporate all that water and moisture off of it, but not to cook it. And so then it'll dry out and it'll literally be, you know, as dry as these were. And then they can package them and then you can sell them, and then you can buy them already sprouted like that, and then you can use them in whatever way you want. Or sometimes what people do is companies will do this. They'll sprout the grain, stop the sprouting process, dry it, and then grind it into flour. So now you've got sprouted grain flour, which is, you know, the benefit of that is that it's more absorbable and it's easier to digest. Some people even say that the gluten gets broken down and it's easier to tolerate. But that's, so they call that, so there's sprouted grain flour, and then there's another, you know, the other process was where you never did dry it or grind it to flour, you just made it into bread right away, and they call that flourless sprouted bread. So two different types of bread made from sprouted grains. So here's a little image of, you know, what is a sprouted grain, and basically what I just described. But yeah, so it's just a way of enhancing the nutrition. You get more out of it this way, and people have an easier time digesting. The theory is with digestive issues, and a lot of people have digestive issues, is that they're not able to break down a lot of the grains that they eat. And you know, we eat a lot of grains in our society. We're eating a lot of wheat, we're eating a lot of corn, we're eating a lot of rice, and none of it's been sprouted. So we think, you know, that's one of the theories, is that that's one of the issues. And so by doing the sprouting and then drying, you just get better digestion out of it and more nutrition as well. So there's a few products, like I said, you know, the companies will do this. They'll sprout the grains and then they'll dry them and then they just package them up, and then you buy them